Hi, everybody. My name's Steve. I'm a research fellow at the Digit Center. I'm really pleased today to be able to welcome Sanna Ojanperä, who's going to speak about a report that she was involved in for Fair Work entitled Skills for the Planetary Labor Market, Indian Workers in Platform Economy. So Sanna is a quantitative researcher studying the intersection of international development, digitalization, and the role of data. She's currently working on her doctoral thesis at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford. And her doctoral research is funded by the Alan Turing Institute, which is the UK's National Institute for Data Science and AI, where she also co-convenes the Data and Inequality Interest Group. She also consults as a data scientist for development organizations such as GIZ in Germany, the World Bank, and the Inter-American Development Bank. There's lots more I could say, but I think I'll hand straight over to Sanna for her talk, which we're all looking forward to. After the talk, we'll have hopefully about 15 or 20 minutes for discussion, and hopefully people can pitch in with some questions and comments and turn their cameras on. So without further ado, over to you, Sanna. Thanks very much.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Gemma, and thanks a lot, Stephen, for the kind introduction there. Let me just go ahead and share my screen. So hopefully you can see my screen at the moment. Would anyone mind just shouting out if Perfect. That's the case?
Yes.
Brilliant. So indeed, today I'll be talking a little bit about the skills for the planetary labor market, and especially looking at the perspective of Indian workers in this platform economy. And just before I shared my screen, I dropped the URL in the chat where you can go ahead, read a little bit about the report and download it as well in case you want to have a browse during the talk or afterwards. So please go ahead and check that out. I'm very, very happy to be able to share these findings with you today. We published the report a year or so ago, and I wanted to give a shout out to my excellent team of co-authors who are based both in Oxford at the Oxford Internet Institute, and then also in India in a couple of different institutes. And additionally, this report and the entire research study would not be possible without our excellent research participants. We had a chance of surveying and interviewing platform workers, platform managers, and then also TVET stakeholders in India. And that's technical and vocational education and training, what the acronym stands for. I also wanted to acknowledge our support teams at the Oxford Internet Institute and at the Fair Work Foundation, which is based at the OII, and then also our funder, the GIZ, the German International Development Agency, for supporting this work, and then also wanting to really get the findings of our work to then inform their own work within the development partner perspective. So as I get started, I wanted to make sure that I share a couple of definitions. Within this center and within this seminar series, we have been talking a lot about the futures of work. So I'm sure that many of you are really familiar and perhaps do research within these areas. But just in case we have anyone in the audience who isn't quite as familiar, I wanted to make sure that we're kind of on the same ground with some basic definitions initially. So I'll be talking a lot about digital labor platforms today. And what I mean by that is essentially just a company that uses digital resources to mediate value-creating labor interactions between consumers and individual service-providing workers. So these are quite a specific kind of company that has emerged only in the last couple of decades or so, and is a really important player as we are looking into these sort of digital ways of working, which is why we also are researching the topic, as there isn't quite as much there in terms of research findings as there are questions at the moment, and especially for the Indian context. Further, there are two broad types of what we are calling digital labor platforms. We have geographically tethered platforms, and then what we call cloud work platforms. And let me say a couple of words about those. So what we term to be geographically tethered platforms are essentially platforms that require a job to be done in a particular place, so a geographic location. This could be, for instance, delivering food to an apartment, or maybe driving a person from one part of town to another. But even if this is a locally based job, it still requires this independent contract that is delivered digitally for this job to take place. And the other category, and what our work really focuses on, are cloud work platforms. And these are platforms that enable work to be performed from really anywhere via the internet. So an example of this could be maybe translating a document to another language that a client might be wanting to get done, and contracting through the platform a worker who gets that job done. So that is what we mean by cloud work and platforms that facilitate that. So that out of the way, let me say a couple of words about our research context in India. So India, being a really big country, it also has 560 million internet users. And out of those users, people between 20 and 39 years of age represent just over half of them. So this actually makes India the second largest digital market in the world, and also quite a fairly young population of these people that are online. In the economy in general, there has been a shift away from agriculture and towards industry and services. And there's also a large population of highly educated English speakers, which matters a lot for the context that we are thinking about here in terms of skills training, in terms of working on these cloud work platforms. However, having a really large working age population of nearly 900 million, India faces job creation as a key issue at the moment, also with that shift in terms of the industrial makeup. So against this kind of background, one could pose the thought that digital labor platforms might indeed provide an essential income and also a much needed opportunity to improve livelihoods. Although previous research points to specific challenges with this kind of work as well. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through those challenges in much detail, but I would invite you to look into the report. Again, the link that I shared earlier in the chat, where we have a little bit of a lit review where you can look for yourself some of the key research areas there. However, I'll be touching on many of the topics in the course of the talk. And finally, India, in some of the recent estimates carried out by ILO, has found India to be the largest supplier of labor on some of the largest global cloud working platforms, while also providing the 5th largest share of labor demand within the set of the largest cloud working global platforms that they studied. So it seems like India indeed is a very big player within the scene of cloud working based on some of these initial studies. And again, you'll find references to all of these studies in the report as you'll look into it in more detail. On the side of skill development landscape, then India considers skill development to be a core priority for the Indian government, and this has been especially so over the last couple of decades. And at the same time, the skill training and then also TVET, so technical and vocational education and training landscape, is actually quite large and quite complex. In India, it comprises a wide array of programs, organizations, and also formal and informal practices within and around of those organizations. So there's a lot happening, especially linked to the more traditional sectors in terms of skill development and skill certification. Just to give you a sense of the growing budgets, here's an example of the yearly central government budget allocation for skills development within unions. And you can see that it's been growing quite steadily. So there's a lot of policy focus on the skills development in India. We have this growing phenomenon of this cloud work taking place through platforms happening. And this poses a lot of questions for us as researchers, and then for also actors within this landscape, for instance, GIZ working in the development field and looking to perhaps support skill training in the best way to improve livelihoods, create jobs, and increase opportunities for individuals around India. So a lot of questions can be then asked. And the way that we structured our research project around this landscape is looking at 5 different research questions. And initially, we wanted to see what are the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on Indian cloud workers and the cloud work landscape. And I would just draw your attention to the fact that we were researching on this topic in late 2020 and in early 2021, with the report being published in mid 2021 or so. And obviously the pandemic has continued further than that. So what I'll be talking to you about is really reflecting the time period during which we surveyed and interviewed our participants. We then also wanted to ask another research question on what skills are particularly relevant for cloud workers in India and how are they acquired. Further, we then wanted to also look at what factors support or limit cloud workers in acquiring the skills that they need for their work, and what strategies do they use to overcome those obstacles. Then relatedly, what connections and interactions exist between the platform economy, informal work, and skills training. And finally, what conclusions can be drawn for future skills training approaches, and again, in particular for development cooperation, as we were working together, looking at these topics with GIZ, which focuses on development cooperation. So just a couple of words about how we went about organizing this study. We adopted a mixed methods research design, and we had essentially 4 different levels of inquiry. We started with a theoretical inquiry into just literature, synthesizing theory and empirical findings that then helped us to inform the research questions. We moved on to qualitative inquiry with stakeholder interviews, so especially people that are involved in the Tethered ecosystem in India, and analyzing that data then again further helped us to inform our research questions. We then took a quantitative and qualitative approach to survey cloud workers, which included both kind of open-ended qualitative questions and then also quantitative data that we recorded through the survey. And here we administered it to 405 cloud workers, with the initial interviews being 12 stakeholders. And we concluded then with a qualitative round of cloud worker interviews, where we interviewed 31 semi-structured, 31 cloud workers, to then also help contextualize some of the research findings that we did find from the survey and the previous phases. And we felt that this sort of way of combining quantitative and qualitative information, and also making sure that we involve stakeholders, people who work in the Tethered ecosystem, and also platform managers, for instance, was very helpful in grounding our research really well into what are the current developments in the country. Just a quick summary of the platforms we included in this study. We had 2 types of cloud work platforms: microworking platform, which we selected to be Amazon Mechanical Turk. And then we had 3 freelancing platforms, Freelancer and Upwork, which are kind of global platforms, and then TrueLancer, which is an India-based cloud working platform. And the 2 categories are a bit different in the way that they operate. So microwork, especially through Amazon Mechanical Turk, tends to include things like surveys, image identification, transcription and annotation, content moderation, data collection and processing, and then transcription and translation. So often can be kind of smaller tasks, whereas some of the other freelancing oriented platforms have perhaps larger kinds of tasks, and they tend to include more web and software development, web and graphic design, content and research writing, business services, and sales and marketing. And the way we went about selecting these platforms in particular was looking at the traffic that they receive from India, which led us to favoring these over some of the other options. And then also looking into current research and seeing that there was some research link with Indian subjects and these platforms. So we thought that these would be the most relevant for studying cloud work in India. Looking at our survey respondents, then the 405 that we surveyed, Here is the map of India with the states, state borders visible. And we've included as different colored rings the respondents from these different platforms. And we were quite happy that they were quite well distributed around the country and around the states. You could see maybe somewhat of a concentration of MTurk workers in the south and in the east of the country, and then a little bit of concentration of Upwork workers in the bigger cities. But we thought that it was a good sample for the size of the sample that we had availability of obtaining for the study. Let me then go straight ahead to the findings, and first looking at the first research question, so impacts of COVID-19 on cloud work. And here, what was really prominent was the fact that there has been a surge in new signups. So 18% of all the workers we surveyed started actually working after the pandemic, and there were many reasons for that, but especially just being able to access new working opportunities with the pandemic disrupting the traditional working arrangements that individuals had was an important one. Also, 62% of cloud workers that we surveyed reported spending more time working or looking for work since the pandemic started. And this especially had to do with the fact that it seems that there was an increasing competition on the platforms, given that there was this new influx of new workers. Indeed, more competition and then fewer jobs since the pandemic. So there was also a disruption on the side of the clients posting work, which led to then again further competition for the jobs that were available. And then also 79% of the respondents agreed or strongly agreed that cloud work will grow in importance in comparison to traditional employment as a result of the pandemic. So this was a very strongly shared sentiment from the majority of the respondents that we surveyed, that they do believe this way of working is indeed going to remain and going to still increase after the pandemic. Let me then move to the second area, so looking at skills for cloud work, and I'm going to look at this from a couple of different perspectives. So as we were looking at what kinds of skills are useful, it was a variety that were found to be useful, so especially communication skills, technical skills, platform-related skills, and learning skills were particularly valued. And in the report, you will find the skill classification that we used, which is based on previous research. And then we amended a little bit based on our findings from desk research on India. But indeed, communication skills and technical skills absolutely leading amongst the various skill categories. Then additionally, looking at skills that are being developed on the job, there was a preference for soft skills like communication and organizational skills, and then also personal dispositions that were developed on the job. And with personal dispositions, I mean things like resilience, perhaps. So these were the areas that the workers felt that they do tend to be developing during working on the platform tasks. On the other hand, technical learning and platform-related skills were ones that a lot of the surveyed workers reported developing during leisure, so taking extra time outside of their working hours to really be able to develop and then be utilizing for the jobs on the platform. And interestingly, platform-related skills were sort of during leisure rather than necessarily on the job, which we thought highlights the fact that perhaps many of the platforms still have quite specific ways of functioning that might not be quite so clearly identifiable as one starts working on the platform. And many workers felt the need to be looking for extra information about the platform and how to work on those platforms in specific. Looking at the four platforms in comparison to each other, we found that broad patterns of skill development were quite related across the four. Looking at skill development on the job, the MTurkers differed from others by focusing more on technical skills and computer literacy. And this perhaps reflects the kind of task division, the types of tasks that might be more common for microworking and for mechanical Turk in particular. Looking at leisure time skill development, there was a little bit more variation in the patterns of skill development between platforms, where workers on True Lancer tended to focus a little bit more on soft skills, while the workers on Upwork were training learning skills mainly. And then also MTurkers developing computer literacy and analytical skills as their areas of focus during leisure. So there we found that there was a little bit more divergence. Then looking at genders, also a goal that we had here and a specific research purpose was to see how these outcomes differ between the genders. And the way that we were sampling was to try to have equal groups between those who identify as men and those who don't identify as men, which mainly consisted of women. And what we did find is that, again, the broad patterns of skill development are quite related actually between genders. In terms of some of the differences and looking at on-the-job skill development, women were slightly more likely to develop hard and soft skills on each platform, with a wider gap for communication and organizational skills than those reported by men developing. And then during leisure time, the patterns of skill development were varying again a little bit more between genders, just like they were with the different platforms. With women, they're focusing more on language skills and computer literacy, as well as organizational skills, while men were developing communication, analytical, and technical skills a little bit more often during leisure time. We were also really interested in finding out about the rationales for developing skills, and they varied within three main topics. So the skills that were developed on the job were needed to complete work successfully. And this made a lot of sense to us, right? Logically, if you are faced with a certain job, you need to get a nice conclusion with that job, and there might be specific skills that you then really will prioritize for learning on the job. And maybe you were not able to foresee that before to necessarily develop on your leisure. Now, skills that were developed during leisure included more challenging training that required somewhat bigger investments of time and also of resources, and which had a very clear expected utility for platform work. So this had often to do with technical training, as we saw earlier, and many respondents felt that either they knew that they would be needing that type of technical training for the work that they were trying to get, so therefore they were training themselves, or they were hoping to move to a different area of work that they had not been working yet, and sort of preemptively or prospectively training for that area that they were seeking to move into, that they knew that they would not be able to develop on the job while working in another area that they were hoping to move away from. However, between both of these areas, there were quite similar motivations. So technical skills were developed for more clients in order to attain more clients and also to obtain higher pay, while language skills were developed for mainly fostering and maintaining relationships. This was an area that was often raised as a really important factor in having great client satisfaction, or on the other hand, being an area that needed improvement, as also just the fact of the clients and workers sometimes being from quite different language communities, maybe somewhat different business cultures. There was a need for having great language skills to be able to then have good working relationships. Looking into a third area of findings then in terms of strategies and obstacles for skill development. So workers reported facing challenges in accessing and undertaking learning activities. And again, here we're looking at a learning activity classification that comes from previous research and which we amended a little bit based on the research that we were referring to looking at India in particular. Workers reported quite often having limited opportunities for exchange of tacit knowledge. And this is certainly a feature of the cloud-based work, with having a client and a worker in potentially very different situations or locations, and all of the knowledge being exchanged through the interface of the platform in most instances. And that came at the cost of not really being able to necessarily obtain the tacit knowledge that was required for maybe some of the more specific jobs requiring good client interaction and understanding very well what the requirements for the job were. So this was an area that workers were often experiencing as a challenge. Similarly, there was limited support for collaborative work that workers were reporting. Many were interested in collaborating rather than working completely on their own, but also the way that the platforms tend to be structured doesn't quite facilitate this as easily. And there was even less support, perhaps, in terms of the client side supporting, facilitating arrangements like this. Similarly, resources that were required for training outside of the platform were challenging to come by. Many workers were very interested in training, but this often did necessitate resources, whether it would be in terms of being able to attend or obtain that training, or even the kind of knowledge of being able to find where appropriate training might be offered, were areas where workers were experiencing obstacles. And finally, skill development during leisure, we thought was indicative of limited development opportunities that these platforms offer to their workers. And similarly, an area where workers were expressing interest in having the third sector provide support. And again, with third sector, I'm talking here from the perspective of GIZ as a development partner, which could be perhaps organizing programs to try to bridge some of the demand gaps that appear in the market. In general, self-directed learning activities were favored over collaborative learning activities. And this perhaps echoes the way that the work most often takes place on platforms, being quite self-directed, being as yourself with the client rather than being able to collaborate. So indeed, also the learning was favored to take place in the similar medium. Individual self-directed learning activities and platform-specific learning activities were most popular. And here, the platform specificity was especially flagged up, as in many cases, the mechanisms that are really important for succeeding in working on a certain platform are quite specific for that platform. So being able to understand very well what is needed of you was a central area where workers felt like they were wanting to build strategies around. Being able to access paid online courses or webinars or tutorials was a particular challenge that was especially faced by women. And respondents were also citing a lack of financial and logistical support in developing skills, which we felt was perhaps indicative of a need to support, a need for support to access low-cost learning activities. And again, indeed, I would just echo here that it was both financial and then also just this more tacit logistical support to know where would one be able to go to develop skills. That was certainly lacking. And some of the key constraints that respondents were citing that prevented them from undertaking desired learning activities included time, first of all, and this was for a couple of different reasons. So lack of time, especially owing to caring responsibilities, and then also lack of time due to prioritizing working hours. Many of the workers we interviewed were doing cloud work on the side to another job that they were doing, and they were then trying to organize the cloud work working hours outside of their main work, which led to a shortage of time. Financial constraints, as we also saw in the previous slide already, many of the resources that exist do also cost something, so that was a barrier that many were reporting. And then lack of information and awareness about resources. And within here, again, it was for a couple of different reasons. Respondents were citing lack of time to be able to look for these resources, and then crucially, lack of guidance and mentorship in being able to direct oneself to look for the areas that would be very helpful for a certain type of work or perhaps for a certain platform. Then looking at another area of our findings, the platform economy and skills training. We felt that overall what emerged from this research is that cloud workers are a blind spot for government-led TVET approaches. At the moment, a lot of the TVET approaches, even though there is a rich landscape of them, are quite focused on specific sectors and specific industries within those. And it does appear that cloud work, which can span many sectors and industries while having this quite specific medium of delivery, is indeed a missed area in terms of these resources. The platforms themselves engage in quite limited skills training. We felt that a lot of the respondents were saying that there was quite little that was helpful for them on the platforms. And platforms do have mechanisms to showcase worker portfolios, but there's limited portability of those quite platform-specific skill credentials. So this could also have to do with work history or ratings that workers get for completing specific jobs that then lead to locking in workers in some ways to particular platforms. Also, the ability of workers to utilize their what you could call off-platform experiences and their educational background to increase their successes on platform, we found depended on a variety of aspects. So in particular, the platform interface and the work allocation method that they were using could either enable some of this or could really just not make the link between what the worker is able to bring before starting their history on the platform. Similarly, for the type of task or gig, there could be quite a big variation. In some areas, this could be very well matched with kind of off-platform experience. In other cases, not so much at all. And then also client expectations and the wording even of jobs that clients would be forming as they post the jobs that then workers are able to bid on. And then also the form of education or experience was quite impactful on whether it could be utilized on the platform, or if it was something that was a bit harder to be able to translate into successes on the platform. What we are taking away from this topic as research findings as well is that there is a need for a standard, preferable platform-specific skills training course, preferably platform-specific skills training course that would provide basic information, especially about profile building, as this was an area that we felt many who are successfully working on the platform had found ways to really educate themselves on, whereas others who were struggling were also really struggling to find the information on how the profile matters, how the ratings, the history matters for them being able to find more work on that platform, and the algorithm kind of being able to pick that up from your profile. Additionally, it would be vital to improve the portability of worker profiles and these reputation scores, or create external portals in which workers can show off their qualification and experiences without being restricted to one particular platform, where at the moment these lock-in mechanisms quite easily tend to restrict them into. I then wanted to move on to our 7 policy recommendations for development cooperation in particular. And even though we in the report have phrased it as recommendations for development cooperation, indeed, this could be for also other types of actors and stakeholders in the system, like civil society organizations, government actors as well, that link together with development cooperation. So we felt that these are really interesting to put forward to you, as well as you're all interested in this topic in particular. So let me just walk you through the 7 of them. The first one was engaging with and encouraging the growth of cloud worker networks and communities. And here we overall found that through this research, the image of cloud workers that emerges is still that they are quite atomized. They are working alone, facing the clients in most of the cases, and they would be strengthened by having stronger links to the communities. We found that especially communities organized around a specific platform hold a lot of knowledge about that platform. So we thought that it could be quite important to encourage the growth of those kinds of communities, and then also considering the communities as sites of disseminating information that might be developed about skills training, as they are like little ecosystems almost that work around the platform, encouraging and supporting individual workers. So recommendation to tap into that.
Could you try to wrap up in 3 or 4 minutes, Sanna? Is that okay?
Sure.
Thanks.
Secondly, convincing platforms to support and invest in cloud workers' skill development. And here, platforms tend to have this arm's length relationship with workers, but indeed the platforms themselves would be in a good place to develop training resources. And we thought that government and other actors within this area should rather be partnering with platforms that are fairer. And for instance, the Fair Work project at the OII is one way of seeing which platforms are fairer and better partners. Thirdly, supporting the adjustment of existing institutional mechanisms to better cater for cloud workers. These Tethered systems that exist there could be adjusted with perhaps developing new curricula or maybe new skill certification schemes. Fourthly, supporting the creation of platform-specific training courses. And again, we heard that these platforms have quite specific ways of working. So there seems to be a lot of interest for training from the side of the workers and difficulty of finding that. So it would seem that especially resources that maybe are catered for different ranges of experience and maybe having little English skills would be especially helpful. And within this space, as the platform is a site that collects a lot of information about workers and whether they are doing well or not so well on the platform, there could be mechanisms of re-intermediation that could be introduced to especially support the vulnerable workers, perhaps owing to gender, perhaps owing to level of experience. Fifthly, advocating for a jurisdiction spanning policy environment that could improve cloud workers' access to skill development. Essentially establishing governance frameworks to be able to regulate cloud work better. There's indeed a lack in the evidence base of even understanding what constitutes an occupation in these days when you do have work like cloud work. So being able to add to the evidence there would be very important. Ultimately, including access to skill development for cloud workers in legislative action to foster due diligence in global supply chains is another great side of potentially being able to act on this. Again, increasing the evidence base there about cloud work and maybe the assumptions about supply chains would be helpful. And then finally, supporting further research and develop pedagogical tools to share knowledge about cloud work could be very helpful, because there are many under-researched topics, as we have heard. You could be looking at Indian companies' reliance on cloud workers, maybe policy options for governments to tackle unfair cloud work, organize upskilling, addressing skill mismatch between the workers and the kind of work that is offered. And then also these pedagogical tools and resources for workers to have some information on the risks and challenges, and then additionally on rewards, maybe even through e-learning or game-based approaches for businesses to have information about how to ethically engage with cloud workers. And then even for legislators and policymakers to have policy briefs on what are some of the issues that emerge through this medium of work becoming available, and how they can better regulate and address those issues as the world of work is changing. So this was a brief run through of a very deep and I think rich report, and I do hope that it will encourage you to look into the deep report a little bit deeper. And thanks so much for participating today, and I look forward to maybe hearing some reflections or questions from you in the time that we have available. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much, Sanna, for such a comprehensive talk about the report. So we do have a little over 15 minutes for questions, comments, and discussion. If you could turn on your camera, if you feel able to, that would be nice to be able to see each other. And I did invite you to either raise your hand, or given that we're a relatively small group, you can wave at the screen and I'll probably be able to see you. So please fire away with any questions, or if you want to write them in the chat and you're not so keen on speaking, that's okay too. Anybody want to take the first question? Yes, we have a hand.
Sorry, I realized that I was going to say, I realized that my first name doesn't really appear. I'm Oliver. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Tony Blair Institute. We're looking at sort of digital labour platforms across the globe. So this is a fantastic research report. So thank you, Sanna, for your presentation. Just a couple of questions from my perspective is, one, what are some of the reasons why digital labour platforms only offer a limited access to training? Did you get a sense that there was some of the reasons why they don't offer this? And then secondly, really interested in understanding what the potential for unions are in relation to the community learning, providing resources within India as a source of training that workers can tap into.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you so much, Oliver. I think you mentioned that your name is. Initially, on the limited access to training, it's a very good question, and the sense that we took away from this research is that there has historically been this idea of kind of having the arm's length relationship, again because of the way that workers are not really employees, in the sense that in traditional firms you would have where then the firm would be training you, and perhaps kind of reinforcing that. It seemed to us that a lot of the resources that the platforms offer are there to just maybe enhance the experience of the worker in terms of the interface being easily responsive, having reflection of the ratings, of the histories, but not so much focusing on the training, maybe to kind of stay away from getting closer to that employee relationship with the workers. However, interestingly, we did find cases where this was reversing a little bit, and maybe the platform logic was starting to shift. I think one of the platforms that we write about is called Gig India, which is focused on Indian workers in particular, and perhaps kind of tries to compete against the global platforms, let's say, in this space. And it seemed like they were offering quite a bit more training for these Indian workers in particular. So we saw that maybe there are also the emergence of different business models, if you will, when there is a specific case for doing this, because at least from our perspective and from talking with the workers, we felt that indeed there usually would be a business case for doing this also from the perspective of the platform. So I think that the question you're asking is very justified in that sense. And on the topic of unions, absolutely, we feel that there would be helpful ways of working together with unions. And also in India, within the TVET landscape, unions are definitely an important part of how all of that is being organized in terms of skill training. I think perhaps there, just the area that would be important to consider is, again, the sort of understanding of what the occupation definition really entails, and so that it is not kind of limited to just the employment relationships, which a lot of unions also do tend to be founded on, but that it's kind of looking broader and then being able to grasp onto those issues that arise just because of that special relations.
Excellent, thanks very much. Udil?
Thank you, Sanna. I'm Ödül. I'm at the University of Sussex at Digit. Thank you for this research, also complementing the terms of the debate that just gets too dominated by US examples sometimes. But I did wonder, you did give us some really helpful information about India as a context, as a labor market, etc. But what have you found that you think might change our overall understanding of sort of working in digital platforms? If you could reflect on how the context of India prompts us to revise maybe some of the things we've been debating. That's question one. So that's like a macro big question. And then my other question is, it was really interesting that the platform workers were keen on self-learning, right? And they didn't really want to collaborate. I wonder if you could reflect on how they feel about their skills as competitive advantage, and they see their relationship as competitive rather than cooperative or collaborative.
Yeah, really interesting questions. Thanks so much, Ödül. Yeah, it's difficult to say to what extent this would translate into a global context or into the context of another country, because we were looking at India so specifically. And given that it also has a very big focus on skill training, even though it is organized quite differently than maybe other countries might be. But I would say that just paying attention to the entire ecosystem of actors around the platforms and how do they kind of work together, or where there might be gaps that nobody really is covering. And perhaps there could be an opportunity for one of those actors to be an early responder, so to speak, within that area, while maybe other mechanisms would be growing. So I think speaking with a lot of the TVET stakeholders, we felt that there was perhaps like a bit less awareness about cloud work in general. A lot of them were more aware about the geographically tethered work, which is, I guess, yeah, more visible on the street, and it's just perhaps bigger population in general. But maybe just kind of awareness raising, like we felt that in a lot of these suggestions that I shared in the end, we were citing a lacking evidence base. So just being able to understand a little bit better what's happening, what the challenges are, how about opportunities, and then where there are actors that might already now be able to address those, and where there is, on the other hand, just need for more understanding to emerge. I think that that's kind of a universal learning that probably applies to many other contexts beyond India as well. And then, yeah, the self-learning was an interesting question as well. We found it to be quite a curious approach there. We didn't really feel, even though a lot of the workers were citing this competition for jobs, and that with the search of new registries, that there just was kind of a tougher competition. But I think beyond that, a lot of them didn't really face it like in the sense of competitive advantage, or being worried about others in the community, or kind of guarding their secrets in a sense. I think the picture that emerged to us is that the sort of self-directed learning approaches over collaborative learning approaches were also maybe necessitated by just the medium of engaging in work on the platforms, as you have your computer set up and you come on your desk, and you maybe have your phone also where you try to tap on the jobs and then you use the computer to do them. That facilitated then going in the meantime to YouTube and looking at a video, or looking at resources online on your own. I think just scheduling was an issue in general, which of course kicks in as you start organizing something more collaboratively. But it's interesting, yeah, because I feel that they did really rather rely on the community in many ways as well. One of the recommendations we put forward, the first one, is to strengthen the community and to kind of try to link these atomized workers to each other, because we felt that especially around specific platforms, you had these informal groups of workers that would share a lot of like very practical knowledge of how they might have found ways to go around a certain challenge or restriction, and then we're rather kind of quite freely sharing these successes with each other and trying to support each other. So I didn't feel like there was kind of the competitive advantage, like guarding your skills type of rationale that emerged quite as much in the discussions that we had. Thank you.
Thank you. Really interesting and important work. Thank you, Sanna.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Absolutely, thanks. And Jackie, you have your hand up.
Sorry, I'm in a hotel room, so on my phone, so it's a bit basic, I'm afraid.
No
First of all,
worries.
thank you very much for all of that. I just wanted to raise, I suppose, two little questions. One is pre-COVID, based on my experience of knowing people who work as translators, for example, they were very familiar with using chat rooms to ask each other about tips on how do you translate, especially very technical terms. So I was surprised about some of your findings, and I wondered if there's a differentiation between people who've been doing it for a long time pre-COVID and newbies who don't know their way around the system is one question. So were you able to differentiate between those? And the second question was related to some work some of our colleagues have done around these platforms in Nigeria and in the UK on selling secondhand clothes on these retail platforms, largely for young people. And the researcher in the UK, Monica Richards, who worked with the Depop platform, found that they actually provided a phenomenal level of support and skills, targeting top sellers or people who are doing really well, helping them learn how to present themselves, how to deal with a platform, and even having meetups where they met in person to discuss what ways they could best sell themselves like that. So I wonder why, is it because there's a difference between the types of platforms? So the ones you were looking at cover quite a spectrum of activities, whereas ones like Depop or Vinted, and they cover a very specified, it's about selling, making yourself look good on selling clothes for a particular type of community of people. Is there a difference there between them?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jacqueline. I think you're picking up on really interesting topics that definitely we faced as we were talking with the workers. So if I tackle the second one first, so I don't know about Depop or like UK-based research in quite as much detail, but what I did find, or what we did discuss in the recommendations as well, is that it does appear that many of the more marketplace organized platforms do offer quite a bit more of support. So we did see examples of even, I think, Amazon in India, which organized its own, like something called Amazon India Seller Academy or something, which had quite a lot of resources on how do you become a successful seller, what are the things to do, how do you sort of troubleshoot many of the things that you will be facing. So it seems like maybe the marketplaces are leading with having this sort of support available to a lot of the workers. And we did see that in some other contexts, I think it might have been programs in Kenya and in Pakistan, there are specific programs directed towards cloud workers specifically. I think not necessarily specific to a platform, but to cloud workers specifically, that seems to have been very helpful. And we were recommending that there could be some learning taken from these kind of approaches in other countries. And then also on the side of the market-based platforms that seem like they do have a little bit more of that. Again, the kind of re-intermediation approach there we thought is really valuable one, because again, the platform collects so much information about the worker. If they would be able to maybe use that to support those that are perhaps more likely to be not necessarily quite as successful, and have targeted resources towards workers like that, that would be excellent. And what you were asking about pre-COVID, and that especially the translators already had their chat rooms. We tried in the sample to have a good mix of different levels of experience, and looking at those, we didn't yet manage to do in this report, but we're looking into potentially having future work that extends that a little bit. But so far, we did find that there was differences, especially between communities. Like we found that in the area of doing more digital art and illustration and graphic design, there was quite a bit of more organization. And for instance, we talked to a really interesting collective that set up a website that essentially lists a lot of resources for workers in that same area, on regardless of which platform they work on, where individuals can submit an anonymous survey that shares responses to things like, if you are selling a piece of digital art, how much do you charge per hour? Like very practical things like that. And then they publish the findings of that survey on the website as a resource for anyone else who is interested in this work. So that was really great to see that there seems to be almost institutionalized level of support in some areas of work where maybe there is kind of a longer standing community, in this case of artists who had been working on platforms like this.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Could I just ask one other supplementary quick question? I mean, another issue that came out of the UK-Nigeria study was advice about tax. And basically, especially because these other platforms are very young people, they weren't sure what, if at all, they had to pay income tax on their earnings. And the platform was very reluctant to offer advice about this. And one of the recommendations from that report was that these people needed some kind of idea or a suggestion of where to go to work out what their tax obligations were. Was that anything? I know yours was mainly on skills, etc., but was there anything that came up around that type of thing? Because that's a relatively important issue for these workers.
Yeah, definitely. So in the report, you'll find the taxonomies for skills and the taxonomies for learning activities that we were using in the study. And indeed, within the skill taxonomy, we included like a specific group of platform-related skills that are exactly those questions of what does it mean to be like a freelancer on the platform, and then facing those kind of issues like the self-employed tax rate. So that was a specific set of skills that we were inquiring about. And that was actually one of the sets of skills that were consistently reported as really important to develop, or really important for the workers to be using in their tasks on the platform.
Great. Time for one more quick question from Dimitra, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah. Sanna, thank you very much for the presentation. Really interesting. I was wondering if you found any information about the participants mentioning that management of emotions and knowing how to manage emotions and doing kind of emotional work came up in your findings. I'm particularly interested in relation to content moderation, because I think you mentioned it as one of the kind of micro work that you looked into. So was there anything like that related to skills development?
Yeah, definitely. So kind of learning dispositions is, I think, what we were terming them. And that was definitely something that a lot of workers were citing as important for the work on the platform, and then also something that they were looking to develop further. And I think it especially had to do with resilience in a lot of cases, confidence and resilience in particular, because a lot of workers were reporting that it can be quite an upsetting journey of trying to establish oneself, and then perhaps receiving feedback that can be very harsh, or also just having clients take advantage of workers with either having work that is not fully paid, or having scams that one faces on the platform and then kind of learns the hard way. So indeed, there was we had a lot of specific questions about the kind of learning dispositions and the emotional management. But yeah, I think it seems to be a very central topic here.
Thanks a lot.
Excellent. Thanks so much. So more or less right on time. I think we will leave things there with a huge thanks to Sanna for presenting such excellent and important work. I really learned a lot from the talk and looking at the report beforehand too. Thanks everyone for contributing. Unless I'm wrong, this is the last in our season of Digit Debates, but we aim to be back, I think, sometime in the autumn in the new academic year. So hopefully see some of you then, and do go ahead and sign up for our mailing list on the website if you haven't. And finally, you should have a poll on your screen. It would be great if you could respond to that and let us know what you think was good. Thanks very much, everybody. Nice to see you. Take care and enjoy the summer.